Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending when it is you're watching this. One of the positives for lockdown, for me personally, has been fewer evening meetings. So Gemma and I have had a bit of a binge watching of some of the old classic comedies. Some on DVDs which we've acquired over the years, and some on those TV channels which constantly show repeats anyway. So what have we watched? A little bit of Hi-de-Hi, actually quite a lot of Hi-de-Hi. We're almost done on that one, to be perfectly honest. Not so much, but a little of Dad's Army. Quite a few of Gemma's favourite. She likes Hyacinth Bouquet from Keeping Up Appearances. And one that I would have loved to have shown a clip from today, which is Hello, Hello. If you get a chance, have a look on one of those sites or online and find the clip where Michel of the Resistance first appears to tell René that he's to be the new hero of France, and watch his response. As I read this passage and was reminded of Gideon's initial calling, my thoughts were immediately to that scene. René is not exactly the most enthusiastic resistance fighter. In fact, he's the complete opposite of the person Michel describes in the clip, where he's being told, not asked, but told that he's going to replace. René spends the next 9 series trying to get out of the role by finding excuse after excuse, not to do all the things that he still ends up doing anyway. In reality, he is a hero. The first things we're told about Gideon are that he's likewise the unlikely and unwilling hero. That he's actually trying to get away from the action, and he's coming up with excuse after excuse. Some of this isn't immediately obvious in the passage we read, but digging into the meaning, it's exactly what we find. You see, actually, Gideon is hiding. In verse 11, it says he's beating wheat in the winepress. Why? To hide it from the Midianites. Sounds okay, but actually, nonsense on both counts. Firstly, you don't beat wheat in a winepress. You beat wheat out in the open, usually in a breezy place to aid winnowing, which is the separating of the straw from the wheat. You can't do it in a confined space, which is what a winepress is. A winepress at this time wasn't the screw-driven press we might think of today. Wine was processed using a pair of pits, either hewn out of a rock or dug out of the ground and then lined with rocks and sealed with plaster. Grapes would be dumped into the upper wine press, where they would be trampled barefoot and the juice flowed into the lower pit, the wine vat. The fact that Gideon was threshing grain in a confined wine press, rather than where it should be done in an exposed breezy place like a hilltop, indicates his fear of being seen. He's hiding. And secondly, the verse says that he was doing this to hide the grain from the Midianites. But there's perhaps some humour in this. A bit like, again, if you know Hello, Hello. René, what are you doing with that servant girl? And the excuses there also get more and more elaborate. Gideon, what are you doing hiding in the winepress? I'm not hiding. I'm keeping the grain safe. No, Gideon was keeping himself safe. The words of the angel in verse 12, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," to someone hiding in a winepress could possibly be interpreted as a little sarcastic, or at the least ironic. And the Bible is actually full of stories of irony and double meaning, so this would not be an odd understanding. But it's also prophetic. And there's a play on words in the name Gideon as well, which does mean mighty warrior, but also means to hack or thrash. Gideon may have seen himself as living up to his name with the latter, whereas God has other plans. The Hebrew phrase used here as mighty warrior is Gibor Hael, used to describe David's select warriors who had performed great exploits in battle. Gideon may have looked around and thought, who, me? And rightly so. And the verses that follow this initial encounter deal with Gideon trying to now find an excuse why God doesn't really mean him. You'd think that an angel appearing would be a shocker enough, but not for Gideon. He starts to argue and comes up with excuse after excuse, like, how can God be there when I see so much hardship? I know of God's deeds in the past, but I don't see them now. Rather than a man of great faith, Gideon feels abandoned by God. Rather than protected by God's presence, he asks, why has God cut us off? Again, the Hebrew word is natash, which means forsake or reject us. I've probably not pronounced either of those correctly, but you get the point. Then the next excuse why he can't possibly accept this calling is because he's the youngest in the smallest and weakest tribe. So that just wouldn't be possible or right. Well, we know from other stories that this is a common theme. And God gives Gideon the same answer that he gave Moses and others to follow. I will be with you. And then, when all these are overcome, Gideon gets 3 signs from the angel from verse 20 onwards. The first, that the angel is not eating. The second, the fire from the rock. And the third, the angel miraculously disappearing. Gideon doesn't ask for these, he's given them. What's it going to take to convince this guy? Well, he is now convinced that God is calling him, for the moment at least. Although, of course, it's not the last of the signs he's still going to want, which I guess we come to next week. So what do we make of all this? It's a great story and a great scene. Well, the obvious message has to be about calling, doesn't it? Gideon is one of many examples throughout the Bible of God calling the weakest and the most unlikely or unwilling to take up positions of authority and to do great deeds. To do them in God's strength and for God's glory, and of course that's partly the point, of course. But also to encourage and enable each of us to know that it's God's power within, because that calling is not just for specific people, but is for all. Is God calling you? Yes, of course God is. It may be a specific ministry for you. Is God calling you to lead worship, to be a support, serving in various ways, to evangelism? There are specific ministries God calls us to, but God calls all of us to serve in some way, to minister and to witness, which is different from evangelism, but to witness and tell the story of our faith. Here's a great quote. Christine Payne refers to herself as an Australian activist, evangelist and author. God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the call, which is all of us, actually. The example of Gideon and of Moses or David or Noah or Joshua or so on is that they're examples of God's call for each of us. It's not a case of are you called, but of what are you called to. And God qualifies that calling often despite us and not because of us. But there's something about Gideon that resonates for me, I think, more than some of these other characters. Yes, he was the youngest in the smallest tribe, and God used him. We may feel too weak or inadequate as well, but that's no excuse. Yes, he was scared stiff and hid. Jonah probably knew that hiding wouldn't work, so he ran away 400 years later. But God used Gideon's fear. As we're scared a little, I'm sure, when we find ourselves in situations where we need to speak about our faith. That's normal, but it's not an excuse. Yes, he tried all the excuses. Moses wasn't so eloquent, but Gideon tried to talk his way out. We may be good at speech or not, get tongue-tied or don't feel we know enough, or talk too much. But the thing that really strikes me about Gideon is that he was honest about how he felt and said so. No, he didn't feel his faith was strong. In fact, he felt God had let his people down and abandoned them. He had doubts and questions and hurts about God, not just himself. Not only did he not trust his own ability, but he didn't think God cared. And he struggled with his own relationship with God and faith with God. He was honest, and God responded to that honesty. And I suggest that's a very powerful testimony. Those of us who did the Faith Pictures course, half during Lent and then finished online, we looked at our own stories and about honesty in sharing those stories. Some of us may have struggles, questions, doubts. No, not some, most. All, perhaps? But these are real, and actually they're more often the feelings and experiences that others can relate to when we tell our story of faith. There's a story as part of Genesis in the life of Jacob where he wrestles with God. After they fight all night, God renames him Israel, which is the start of the nation or the name of Israel and where it comes from. And Israel means struggle. It's okay to grapple with God. It's okay to still have questions and struggles, but it's not okay to use these as an excuse to avoid God's calling to the ministry we are to do, or to be witnesses of our faith when asked. In fact, it's even more of a reason. God uses what's ordinary to make extraordinary. What seems ordinary to us, our lives, our questions, our fears, our struggles, our hurts, are extraordinary when God is involved. Because as in the example of Gideon, with God, nothing and no one is just ordinary. I'd like to finish by sharing something I used again in Faith Pictures, so forgive me if you've heard it. But I first heard this in a sermon, so yes, it's nicked from someone else, of course. And it comes from the wedding at Cana, because if you remember the story, maybe even Jesus didn't feel ready. When his mother tells him the wine has run out, Jesus replies, "Why involve me?" But he's gently encouraged by her, and that's the start of his ministry. So even Jesus, uncoincidentally, fits into the pattern. We're in good company when we think we're not good enough. We're not, but God makes us so and calls each of us to be witnesses, especially amid the questions and struggles. God can use us all, just like these likewise imperfect Bible characters. Noah was a drunk. Abraham was too old. Jeremiah was too young. Sarah laughed at God. Joseph was a daydreamer. Jacob lied, saying his wife was his sister. Leah was ugly, symbolic of being out of favour with God. Moses was a murderer and stuttered. Gideon, as we've been looking at, was afraid. Rahab was a harlot, as was Hosea's wife. David was an adulterer. Elijah felt suicidal. Isaiah preached naked and barefoot. I don't know what picture you may have been expecting there. Jonah ran away. Micah was a thief who robbed his own mother. Naomi was a widow. Solomon was far too rich, and Mary and Joseph were far too poor. Job went bankrupt and in fact lost everything. Miriam was a gossip. Amos's only training was in the school of fig tree pruning. John the Baptist ate bugs and was just a bit odd. John the disciple was self-righteous, and Peter, of course, denied Christ. The disciples all fell asleep while praying. Thomas doubted. Martha worried and was a bit of a fusspot. Mary Magdalene was allegedly possessed, and the Samaritan woman was divorced more than once. Zacchaeus was too small. Paul was a murderer and had a short fuse. Timothy had stomach ulcers and was ill, although not as ill as Lazarus, who was dead. I'm sorry about the cartoon. And of course, Jesus didn't feel ready. So, remind me, what's your excuse again? Amen.